beneath the Arctic ice. Something stirs in the dark that science has only just begun to name. What lives down there may rewrite everything you thought you knew about life on this planet. You are listening to Depth Unseen. Where light ends, the story begins. Tonight we go somewhere most humans will never go. Settle in, close your eyes, and drift with us. Beneath the Arctic ice, there is a world so old, so sealed away from human hands, that it existed for millions of years without a single pair of eyes ever witnessing it. Not one, not a diver, not a submarine, not a camera. Just darkness, just cold, just something alive, moving, breathing in a way we do not yet fully understand. The Arctic ice above it is not just frozen water. It is a ceiling, a lid, wall between our world and something else entirely. And for most of human history, we simply accepted that wall. We looked at the white expanse and thought, nothing could survive down there. We were wrong. We were so completely, so profoundly wrong. Tonight we are going beneath the Arctic ice together. Not on the surface, not near the shore. We are going to the place where the ice stretches for thousands of miles in every direction, where the sun has not touched the water below in centuries, where the pressure builds so slowly and so steadily that your body would not last a single second without protection. We are going into the deep, and I promise you, by the time this night is done, crossed, you will never look at a patch of white ice the same way again. Let us begin at the surface, because everything that happens below begins with what happens above. Picture it. You are standing on the Arctic ice. Beneath your feet, the ice is maybe 2 meters thick, sometimes 3. It is hard as stone. It creaks and groans under wind and temperature. These low sounds that travel for miles across the flat, frozen surface like distant drums. The sky above is either blinding white during the summer months or pitch black during the long Arctic winter. When the sun disappears for weeks, sometimes months at a time, the wind cuts through everything. The temperature drops so low that exposed skin freezes in minutes. Nothing about this place whispers comfort. Nothing about this place says, come closer, look deeper. And yet beneath your feet, separated from you only by 2 meters of frozen water, something is happening. Something has always been happening. The underside of Arctic sea ice is not smooth. Most people imagine it like the bottom of an ice cube, flat and clear and simple. But the real underside of sea ice is a landscape. It has ridges and valleys, caves and channels, textures and formations that shift with the seasons like a slow-moving mountain range. And coating every inch of that underside, clinging to every ridge and crevice in conditions that should not support life at all, is a thin layer of ice algae. Tiny, microscopic, ancient beyond imagining. These algae are the first secret of the Arctic ice. They live in a place where there is almost no light, where the temperature is below freezing, where the salt content of the water surrounding them fluctuates wildly as ice forms and melts, should not exist. Every rule of biology says they should not exist there, and yet they do, and they have, for longer than human civilization has been telling stories. They are the base of everything. They are the bottom of a food chain that stretches from the underside of the ice all the way down, miles down, to the seafloor. Everything beneath the Arctic ice. Every creature, every organism, every ghostly pale thing drifting through the dark. It all begins with these tiny, invisible threads of life, clinging to frozen ceilings in the dark. But wait, because what scientists recently found beneath the Arctic ice is something far stranger than algae. In 2025, a team of researchers from the University of Copenhagen made a discovery that shook the scientific community so quietly that most of the world barely noticed. They found bacteria living beneath the ice that were not supposed to see ice. Not just surviving there, but thriving. Bacteria that were fixing nitrogen. That is, bacteria that were taking nitrogen gas dissolved in the water and turning it into something that other living things could use as food. This process, called nitrogen Kitson fixation, is something you might expect to find in warm tropical waters, sunlit seas, full of colour and heat. You would not expect to find it happening in total darkness, beneath ice, in the most remote and central waters of the Arctic Ocean. But there they were. These bacteria, a group called non-cyanobacterial diazotrophs. Let us call them the shadow fixers, because that is really what they are. They were doing something remarkable. They were feeding the Arctic from the inside out. They were creating nutrients out of almost nothing, out of dissolved gas and cold water and darkness. And in doing so, they were feeding the algae. The algae were feeding everything else. And everything else was a secret world that we are only beginning to map. Here is what makes this discovery so astonishing, so worth lying in the dark and thinking about tonight. Scientists had always assumed that the Arctic Ocean was a kind of nutritional desert, that it was too cold, too dark, too sealed off to support the kind of life cycles found in other oceans. They thought the Arctic survived on whatever nutrients were delivered by rivers, by ocean currents from warmer waters, the slow accumulation of Mercurial's materials sinking from above. They thought it was a passive system, something waiting to be fed, something dependent on the outside world for its survival. But the shadow fixers changed everything, first, because they showed that the Arctic ice is not a passive lid sitting on a passive ocean. It is an active system. It is producing its own nutrients. It is feeding itself. From beneath, in the dark, and it has probably been doing this for millions of years without anyone knowing. Drift deeper with that for a moment. An entire ocean feeding itself in the dark, sustaining a web of life that we only just discovered exists. And the ice above it, which we have spent decades worrying about melting away, is not just frozen water. It is a habitat, it is a nursery, it is a world unto itself. Now go deeper, because the algae and the shadow fixers are just the beginning. They are the ceiling of what hides beneath the Arctic ice. Below them, the water column stretches down and down and down. The Arctic Ocean is not the deepest ocean on Earth, but it is deep enough. Parts of it plunge to nearly 5.5 kilometres below the surface. 5.5 kilometres. Stand 5.5 kilometres above the ground, and you would be higher than most commercial aircraft fly. Now flip that distance downward into cold black water under thousands of miles of ice and sky, and you begin to understand the scale of what we have not yet seen. In those depths, things live that have no names yet, things that glow with their own light in a darkness so complete that your eyes would never adjust to it, no matter how long you stayed. Things that have evolved over millions of years in conditions so extreme that their biology reads like science fiction. Transparent bodies, enormous eyes for catching the faintest glimmer. chemical sensors tuned to frequencies we cannot even measure. And beneath the water, on the Arctic seafloor itself, something even stranger waits. In late 2024 and into 2025, researchers publishing Hull Oceanin journals at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institutions described the Polaris hydrothermal vent system, now known as the northernmost seafloor hydrothermal system ever documented on Earth. Hydrothermal vents. Let us be clear about what these are, because the word is clinical and the reality is anything but. Hydrothermal vents are places where the seafloor cracks open and superheated water comes roaring up from deep inside the Earth. Not just warm water, water that can reach temperatures of 400 degrees Celsius or more. Loaded with minerals, with chemicals, with the raw building blocks of life bubbling up from inside the planet itself. Around most hydrothermal vents in warmer oceans, life explodes. Tube worms the length of your arm, ghostly white crabs with no eyes, mats of bacteria so thick they look like orange and yellow carpets spread across the rocks. All of it thriving without any sunlight whatsoever. All of it drawing energy not from the sun, but from the heat of the Earth itself, a process called chemosynthesis. The word that means making food from chemicals rather than light. These are ecosystems that do not need the sun. They answer to a different star entirely, the molten core turning slowly inside our planet. And now we know that these vents exist under the Arctic ice, not in some distant tropical ocean, not somewhere accessible, but under the ice, the top of the world, in the most remote and unreachable place on Earth. Polaris system is not a conventional black smoker vent like the ones discovered in the Pacific in 1977. It is different, stranger, richer in hydrogen and methane than anything seen before at this depth and location. It is a new kind of vent, a new kind of system, new kind of conversation between the Earth and the ocean that happens in complete isolation from everything human. What lives around the Polaris vents we have barely seen. The surveys have been limited. The access has been difficult to see. The ice above makes deploying robotic submarines enormously complicated. What little has been glimpsed suggests ecosystems tons of complexity and strangeness that rival anything found in the deep Pacific or Atlantic oceans. Life that is adapted not just to cold, but to this specific kind of cold, this specific chemistry, this specific darkness. Life that belongs only here. Life that exists nowhere else on Earth. And somewhere deeper than the Polaris vents, beneath the central Arctic Ocean where no submersible has yet reached. The Freya hydrate mounds are rising from the seafloor off the coast of Greenland. In 2025, scientists documented these structures for the first time at a depth of 3,640 meters, the deepest cold seep methane mounds ever found. These mounds are made of crystallized methane and other gases towering up from the seafloor, like frozen reefs, like cathedrals of gas and mineral, built over thousands of years in slow, absolute silence. And from these mounds, methane flares rise 3,300 meters upward through the water column above, tallest methane flares ever recorded in any ocean on Earth. 3,300 meters of rising gas, rising silently through dark water beneath the ice. Around the Freya mounds, creatures have been found that have evolved to live in conditions that most life on Earth would consider catastrophically toxic. Methane is not a food source for most organisms, but in the deep ocean, certain bacteria have evolved to consume it, and where those bacteria thrive, other organisms follow. A food chain built on poison sustained by darkness, flowering in cold. Think about what this means. Think about what it says about the nature of life itself. We spent centuries assuming that life needed sunlight, that photosynthesis, the process by which plants and algae convert sunlight to food, was the one essential engine of all living things on Earth. Then we found the hydrothermal vents in 1977, and that assumption cracked. And now, beneath the Arctic ice, we find system after system of life that runs on chemistry, on heat, on gas, frozen methane, cathedrals and shadow-fixing bacteria and ice algae clinging to frozen ceilings in the dark. And the assumption does not just crack, dissolves entirely. Life does not need the sun. Life needs chemistry. Life needs heat. Life needs a surface to cling to and a source of energy to draw from, and apparently it will find those things in the most impossible places imaginable, and it will not ask permission from anyone. Beneath the Arctic ice, life did not wait to be discovered. It was simply there, living the whole time. Now, here is the thing that should make your thoughts slow down. For just a moment, thing that sits quietly at the edge of all of this science and asks a question that science cannot fully answer yet. Have explored less than 20% of the Arctic Ocean seafloor. Less than 20%. A body of water covering over 14 million square kilometres we have properly mapped and surveyed a fraction. The rest is conjecture. The rest is inference and estimation, and the educated guesses of brilliant people who know that the blank spaces on the map almost always hide something extraordinary, which means that what we have found so far, the shadow fixers, the Polaris vents, the Freya methane mounds, the ice algae ecosystems, all of these revelations, they are the edge of the thing. They are the very first words of a story that goes on for volumes we have not yet written. What hides beneath the Arctic ice is not a simple answer. It is not a list you can finish. It is a direction, a depth, a darkness that keeps descending past every level of knowing we currently possess. Let us go further still. Let us go to a part of the story that is somehow both more beautiful and more unsettling than anything we have touched on yet. There is something living under the Arctic ice that you have almost certainly never heard of, something that moves through these dark waters in forms so alien that they look more like creatures from another world than from this one. They are called amphipods. Small, shrimp-like creatures, pale and translucent, built for cold and pressure and darkness. They swarm in the millions beneath Arctic sea ice. They cling to the underside of ice floes, feeding on the algae there. They serve as the crucial bridge between the microscopic world of bacteria and algae and the larger world of fish, seals, and whales above. The amphipods are not what I want you to think about right now. I want you to think about what eats the amphipods. Because beneath the Arctic ice, predators are something else entirely. The Arctic cod, a fish so perfectly adapted to sub-zero water that its blood contains proteins that act antifreeze. Proteins that bind to ice crystals forming in its blood and stop them from growing, stop them from destroying the blood cells from within. natural antifreeze. Built into the blood, evolved over millions of years specifically to live in water, that would freeze the blood of almost any other creature on Earth. The Arctic cod moves through temperatures of -1.5 degrees Celsius as casually as a tropical fish moves through warm reef water, owns this cold. It was built for it, and below the Arctic cod, deeper in the water column, in the absolute blackness beneath the ice, something else moves, something larger. Something that has been part of Arctic mythology for centuries, mentioned in the records of indigenous Arctic peoples long before any Western scientist ever sent a sensor into these waters. We will meet it soon. Not yet. Because first we need to understand something about the ice itself, something that changes the meaning of everything we have talked about so far. The Arctic sea ice is not permanent. It never was. It grows and retreats, with the seasons expanding in winter to cover an area larger than the entire continent of Europe, pulling back in summer to reveal open water. But in recent decades, of course, the ice has been retreating further and earlier in the year than at any point in recorded history. The summer minimum extent of Arctic sea ice has been shrinking. The multi-year ice, the kind that survives through summer and builds into thick layered slabs over years or decades, disappearing faster than almost any climate model predicted. And as it disappears, it is revealing things. In early 2025, a team of researchers explored a section of Arctic seafloor that had been covered by ice for centuries. Sealed off. Cut off from light, from human access, from any investigation. When the ice retreated enough to allow a remotely operated vehicle to descend, what they found was not a barren, empty seafloor, scraped clean by cold and time. What they found was a flourishing, astonishing, complex ecosystem of sponges and corals and creatures that had been living in complete isolation. In total darkness, fed by ocean currents carrying nutrients from below. Giants among them. Animals that had been growing slowly, patiently, for decades or centuries. In a world that had no idea human beings existed. There is something devastating and astonishing about that image all at once. A coral that has been growing for 100 years in perfect isolation, knowing nothing of the human world above the ice. Never exposed to a camera, never touched by a diver's hand, never classified or named or studied, just growing, just alive, just being, down there in the dark. And then the ice retreats. Suddenly light touches that coral for the first time in a century, and a machine with cameras descends toward it, and we see it. That moment, that first moment of contact between the human world and something that has existed entirely outside of it for so long, that is not just a scientific discovery. That is something older than science. That is the feeling of standing at the edge of a door that has been sealed for your entire lifetime and finding that when it finally opens, room on the other side is full of life. Beneath the Arctic ice, there are rooms like that everywhere. Rooms we have not opened yet. Rooms sealed by ice and cold and depth. And the simple fact that the Arctic is impossibly difficult to reach and explore. Most of the organisms living in those rooms have never been seen. Many of them have never been named. Some of them are almost certainly species entirely unknown to science. Creatures that evolved in the most isolated conditions on the planet, adapted to a chemistry, and a temperature, and a darkness that nothing else on Earth quite matches. We do not know what they look like. We do not know how they move. We do not know whether they produce light or hunt by pressure or navigate by chemical trails in the water, or whether they live for years or centuries or longer in the cold, slow time of the deep Arctic dark. We simply do not know, and in that not knowing, in that honest gap in the map of everything we understand, something lives. Right now, tonight, as you lie here in the warmth and the quiet, the Arctic Ocean is doing what it has always done. The ice algae are clinging to frozen ceilings in the dark. The shadow-fixing bacteria are turning nitrogens into food in water. So cold it barely registers as liquid for Arctic. The Arctic cod are moving through antifreeze blood in temperatures that should not sustain life. The methane flares are rising 3,000 meters through dark water from the Freya mounds on the seafloor. Polaris hydrothermal vents are pouring mineral-rich hydrogen and methane-laced water into the Arctic Ocean at the top of the world. Pale amphipods are swarming in millions beneath ice floes that stretch for thousands of miles in every direction. And somewhere, in a place that no camera has yet reached, in water so cold and deep and remote that no human technology can yet navigate it comfortably, something we have not yet discovered is alive. It has always been alive. It was alive before the first human being built the first fire. It was alive when the pyramids of Egypt were new. It was alive when Rome burned, and when empires rose, and when the first ships tried to sail the Northwest Passage and got locked in the ice and went silent. And it is alive now, tonight, in the dark beneath the Arctic ice, doing whatever it does, knowing nothing of us, asking nothing of us, simply existing in the cold patience of a world that predates our curiosity by an almost incomprehensible margin of time. But here is the question that should follow you into the dark tonight. The question that none of the scientists who study the Arctic, none of the researchers who have spent careers mapping and measuring and analysing this frozen world, none of them can fully answer yet. We know that the Arctic seafloor has never been fully mapped. We know that less than 20% of it has been surveyed. We know that the ice above makes access extraordinarily difficult, fast. We know that every time the ice retreats and allows even a brief window of exploration, something remarkable and unexpected is found every single time. So what is waiting in the other 80%? What is in the rooms we have not yet opened? What moves through the water column between the Freya mounds and the surface? 3,300 meters above, in the darkness that fills that space like something solid, we do not know. Yet. But part 2 of our journey will take us somewhere specific. Somewhere that researchers have only recently started to understand. A place beneath the Arctic ice where the temperature of the water does something that should be impossible. Where warm water from the Atlantic Ocean pushes northward under the cold Arctic surface layer and creates a boundary, wall of temperature, an invisible line in the water where two completely different worlds meet. And in that boundary, something extraordinary happens. Something that might explain why the Arctic Ocean is not the desert we once thought it was. Something that connects the warmth of the tropics to the darkness of the Arctic deep in a way that no one predicted. The boundary has a name called the Atlantic Water layer. and what lives along it and what moves through it, what it means for the secret world beneath the Arctic ice. That is where we are going next. Tonight, let the darkness hold that question. Let it drift with you into the deep, still hours of the night. Because the Arctic is not done with its secrets. Not even close, beneath the Arctic ice, the Atlantic water layer moves like a ghost. Warm, invisible, threading through the cold dark in a current that has no right to exist this far north. And yet, and it is changing everything. You are listening to Depth Unseen, where light ends, the story begins. Tonight, we continue our descent into the world that hides beneath the Arctic ice. The world sealed away from human eyes. The world that has been living its own vast and unhurried life since long before our kind learned to wonder about it. Host. When we left the first part of our journey, we were standing at the edge of a question. We had learned about the ice algae clinging to frozen ceilings in the dark. We had learned about the shadow-fixing bacteria, turning nitrogen gas into food in water. So cold it barely counts as liquid. We had descended to the Polaris hydrothermal vents at the top of the world, roaring with hydrogen and methane. We had stood above the Freya methane mounds on the Arctic seafloor, watching gas flares rise 3,300 meters through the water, column in total silence. And we had asked the question that no scientist can yet fully answer. What is in the 80% of the Arctic Ocean seafloor that has never been mapped? What moves in the dark between the vents and the ice above? Tonight we go deeper into that question. And we begin with something that sounds impossible, something that sounds like it should not exist in a place defined by cold. There is warm water beneath the Arctic ice. Not at the surface, not near the ice, but deep. Hundreds of meters deep, flowing northward from the Atlantic Ocean, threading under the cold Arctic surface layer like a slow river of heat running beneath a frozen sky. Scientists call it the Atlantic water layer, and it is one of the strangest and most consequential features of the entire Arctic Ocean system. It is, in the simplest terms, a layer of relatively warm, salty water that slides under the cold, fresh surface water of the Arctic, and sits there, trapped, circling the Arctic basin in a slow gyre that takes decades to complete its journey. Let us understand what that word warm means here, because warm is relative. The Atlantic water layer is not tropical. It is not even close to comfortable. Its temperature ranges between roughly 1 and 3 degrees Celsius above zero, which, in the context of the surrounding Arctic water, which can sit at negative 1.8 degrees Celsius, is dramatically, significantly warmer. In the physics of seawater in these extreme cold conditions, a difference of even 1 or 2 degrees is not trivial. It is enormous. The difference between freezing and not freezing, it is the difference between a desert and a living system. The Atlantic water layer enters the Arctic Ocean primarily through a gap between Greenland and Norway called the Fram Strait. This is one of the only places where deep, direct exchange between the Atlantic and the Arctic occurs, kind of doorway in the ocean, where warm, salty Atlantic water flows north, and cold, fresh Arctic water flows south. Through the Fram Strait, year after year, century after century, warm water from the world below has been threading into the Arctic, sinking slightly as it loses heat, and then circling the basin at depths between roughly 200 and 800 meters. invisible to everything above it, secret layer of relative warmth in an ocean defined by cold. And in this layer, in this invisible boundary between the cold, fresh Arctic surface and the warm, salty Atlantic intrusion below, something extraordinary happens, something that marine biologists are only now beginning to fully appreciate. Life concentrates here, not just a little, not just incidentally. Life concentrates at this boundary the way traffic concentrates on a bridge. The temperature gradient, which is the word for the change in temperature over a distance, creates what oceanographers call a halocline and a thermocline together, double boundary, where both salinity and temperature change sharply within a few meters of depth. And in those few meters, thin, invisible wall in the water column, contingents combine to produce concentrations of microscopic life, zooplankton and phytoplankton, and the organisms that feed on them, that rival anything found in the sunlit surface waters of warmer oceans. Think about that. In the middle of the Arctic Ocean, in the dark, hundreds of meters below the ice, a layer of life, invisible, dense, ancient, that no one could see from the surface, that no one could know it was there from any observation made at or above the waterline. It existed only in the deep, only in the transition between cold and less cold, only in that narrow band where the coldest of Atlantic warmth meets the permanent cold of the north. Copepods are among the most numerous animals living in this layer. A copepod is a tiny crustacean, a relative of crabs and shrimps and lobsters, miniaturized almost beyond imagining. Most Arctic copepods are only a few millimeters long. You could fit dozens of them on your thumbnail. They are transparent, or nearly so, their bodies like tiny glass capsules with legs and antennae, moving in slow, deliberate patterns through dark water. They feed on the phytoplankton and algae suspended in the water column, and they are themselves fed upon by almost everything larger. Twas. They are the middle of the food web. They are the link between the microscopic world of algae and bacteria and the visible world of fish and mammals and everything large enough to see with the naked eye. And there are so many of them, so unimaginably, incomprehensibly many of them, pulled. In a single cubic meter of Arctic Ocean water near the Atlantic water layer boundary, you might find tens of thousands of individual copepods. Multiply that across the volume of the Arctic Ocean basin, across the millions of cubic kilometers of water circling beneath the ice, and the number becomes a figure so large it loses meaning as a number and becomes instead an idea. The idea of abundance in darkness. The idea of life thriving in a place designed, as far as most of human history assumed, for absence. Now here is the hook that should make you pause, because the Atlantic water layer is warming. Not slowly, not in geological time, in human time, in decades, in your lifetime. Scientists, studying the phenomenon they call Atlantification, which is the process by which the Atlantic water layer is becoming warmer and pushing deeper and further north into the Arctic basin than it historically did, have documented a remarkable and deeply unsettling trend. The boundary between the warm Atlantic layer and the cold, fresh surface water above it is weakening. The cold, fresh layer that historically sat above the Atlantic water, insulating the surface from the heat below, is thinning, and as it thins, the warm water rises. As the warm water rises, the ice above it melts from below. not just from the warming atmosphere above the ice, from the warming ocean beneath it. The Arctic ice is being attacked from two directions simultaneously, from the warm air above and from the warming Atlantic intrusion below. And the result is an acceleration of ice loss that the earliest climate models did not fully predict. But here is what the scientists did not predict at all. What surprised even the most experienced Arctic oceanographers. As the Atlantic water layer warms and rises, and the boundary between it and the surface water weakens, it is not just melting ice, frost, it is also reshaping the food web. Species that historically lived only south of the Arctic boundary, species adapted to slightly warmer and saltier conditions, are following the Atlantic water northward into the Arctic, to a system that evolved over millions of years in conditions very different from what is now arriving. Atlantic cod, different species from the Arctic cod adapted to antifreeze conditions, has been documented in waters it historically never reached. Atlantic mackerel, certain species of jellyfish, certain types of krill. The warm water layer is essentially acting as a corridor, an underwater highway, along which species from warmer oceans are slowly, year by year, extending their ranges into the Arctic, and as they arrive, they encounter the things that already live there. The native Arctic species, the pale transparent creatures built for cold and dark, the species with antifreeze blood, the organisms that evolved in that specific chemistry and those specific temperatures over millions of years, and the collision between these two worlds, the arriving Atlantic world and the ancient Arctic world, creating ecological situations that have no historical precedent, that we have no model for, that we do not yet know how to predict. In some places, the arriving species are simply adding to the ecosystem. In others, they are competing with and displacing native species. In the deep Atlantic water layer itself, where the two systems most directly overlap, some of the most unexpected biological interactions ever documented in oceanography are being recorded. Organisms that evolved on different sides of a thermal barrier, suddenly finding themselves in the same water. Collision of two worlds happening in the dark, hundreds of meters below the ice, in slow motion. But let us go even deeper now. Let us leave the Atlantic water layer behind and descend past it, past the thermocline, past the halocline, past the zone where Atlantic and Arctic waters meet, and go down into the true deep water of the Arctic basin, into the water that sits below the influence of Atlantic intrusion, into the oldest, coldest, most isolated water on Earth. This deep water, called Arctic bottom water, is extraordinary. It forms primarily in two areas, in the Greenland Sea and in certain shallow Arctic shelf regions, through a process called deep water formation. When sea ice forms on the surface, it freezes the fresh water in the seawater, but leaves the salt behind. This makes the remaining water saltier. Saltier water is denser. Denser water sinks. And when it sinks in the volumes that Arctic sea ice formation produces, it creates massive downward currents of cold, dense, salty water that plunge toward the seafloor, and then spread across the bottom of the Arctic basin. This water is among the oldest water on Earth. Deep water at the bottom of the Arctic basin has been isolated from the surface for centuries, some of it for longer. It has been sitting in darkness, cooling, circling, for a span of time that dwarfs human memory. The oxygen in it was dissolved from the atmosphere centuries ago. The nutrients in it were carried down from surface Voss waters centuries ago. It is very real sense ancient water. Water from a different time. Water that was at the surface of the Arctic when Europe was in the Middle Ages, that sank and has been in the dark ever since. And in this ancient cold dark water, life exists. Not the dense life of the Atlantic water boundary layer. Not the swarming millions of copepods and algae, but a sparser, slower, more isolated life. Animals adapted to extreme cold and extreme pressure and extreme isolation. Animals that grow slowly, live long, and move through the dark in ways that seem more like geology than biology. So slow and deliberate and old are their patterns. The Greenland shark is one of these animals. It is worth pausing here, worth giving this creature the full weight of attention it deserves, because the Greenland shark is perhaps the most astonishing living organism in the entire Arctic Ocean. It is a large shark, growing up to 7 meters in length, longer than most cars. It is pale and grey, and moves through Arctic deep water with a slowness that looks almost like drifting, a barely perceptible forward motion through the dark that belies the quiet efficiency of its predation. And it is old, extraordinarily, almost incomprehensibly old. Scientists studying the age of Greenland sharks by analysing the radiocarbon content of tissue from their eye lenses, which are laid down in layers like tree rings and retain a chemical signature of the water the shark grew in, found individuals estimated to be between 300 and 500 years old. Some estimates push even higher. The maximum age recorded for any Greenland shark is roughly 500 years. But researchers believe that may not be the upper limit, just the oldest one they have managed to study. 500 years. An animal alive beneath the Arctic ice, 500 years ago, alive when Shakespeare was writing his plays. Alive when the first European explorers were trying and failing to navigate the Northwest Passage through the ice above. Alive when most of the countries we call nations did not yet exist in their current form. Alive when the world above the ice looked completely different from anything we recognise today. And still alive now. Still moving through the dark, still hunting. Still breathing water in the cold. Think about what a Greenland shark has outlived. Think about the centuries of human history it has drifted through, unknowingly, beneath the ice. Think about the storms above the surface. The wars, the revolutions, the technological leaps, the changes in climate. All of it happened above, in the sunlit world, while the shark moved slowly through the dark water below, unchanged, unhurried, ancient. It reproduces slowly. It grows slowly. It metabolizes slowly. Its heart rate is among the lowest of any vertebrate animal on Earth. Its body temperature matches the water around it, close to zero. Everything about it is calibrated to the cold and the dark, to a pace of living so different from anything we consider normal, that it operates almost outside our concept of time, forced. And it is not alone in the deep Arctic water, because wherever the Greenland shark hunts, other things live in relation to it, things that it preys upon, things that have evolved alongside it over millions of years, things that belong specifically to this world of cold and dark and ancient slow time. But here is the thing that should settle into you. Quietly as you lie in the dark, Greenland shark was not properly documented living in the high Arctic. beneath the central Arctic ice until relatively recently. For most of scientific history, it was thought of as an animal of the North Atlantic, peripheral, not central to the Arctic system, not living beneath the ice itself. It was discovered in those deep Arctic waters, partly because we began looking harder, with better tools, places we had previously not reached. Which raises the question again, the same question that keeps circling back in every part of this story. What else have we not looked for yet? Because we assumed there was nothing there. The blank spaces on the map of the Arctic seafloor are not empty, because they have been surveyed and found to contain nothing. They are blank, because no one has been there with the tools to look. And every single time someone does go, with the right tools, blank space in the Arctic, they find something. Something that was not expected. Something that rewrites a small corner of what we thought we knew. Now let us go somewhere specific in the story. Was. Let us go to a place that sits at the intersection of everything we have been exploring. A place where the ancient meets the newly arrived. A place where the ice above and the heat below and the old water and the new species and the organisms that have been living in isolation for centuries all come together into a single system that is, right now, in the middle of the most dramatic transformation it has undergone in human memory. The Arctic continental shelves. The Arctic Ocean is not a single deep basin. It has edges. Broad, shallow edges called continental shelves, where the seafloor rises steeply from the deep basin toward the land masses surrounding the Arctic, Russia, Canada, Alaska, Greenland, Norway. These shelves, these are relatively shallow, sometimes only 50 to 200 meters deep, covered by seasonal ice in winter, and often ice-free in summer, and they are among the most biologically productive marine environments on Earth. The Chukchi Sea shelf between Alaska and Russia, the Laptev Sea shelf along the coast of Siberia, the Beaufort Sea shelf north of Alaska and Canada, the Barents Sea shelf north of Norway and Russia. These places are not the remote, mysterious deep ocean systems we have been describing. They are relatively accessible, host. They are relatively well studied, and even here, even in the best studied parts of the Arctic Ocean, scientists continue to find things they did not expect. In the Beaufort Sea shelf, in waters that have been surveyed numerous times over decades, researchers recently found evidence of a massive buried methane reservoir beneath the seafloor, reservoir left over from the last ice age when sea levels were lower and the shelf was dry land, and which is now, as the ocean warms, beginning to release methane into the water above it. Not in catastrophic quantities, not yet, but in measurable quantities, flares and seeps and slotes, slow leaks through the seafloor sediment that were not part of any previous model of this region. The permafrost, which is permanently frozen ground, does not stop at the shoreline. It continues beneath the sea, frozen since the last ice age, preserved for tens of thousands of years beneath cold water and cold sediment, and trapped within it, preserved in frozen time, things that have been locked away since the woolly mammoth walked across the land above. Organic material, ancient organic material, carbon stored in plant matter, and animal remains from a world that no longer exists. And as the permafrost thaws, the warming water above it slowly penetrates. That ancient organic material begins to decompose, begins to release carbon, begins to leak into the ocean chemistry of the Arctic in ways that cascades upward through every level of the food web. Scientists call this the zombie carbon problem. And the name is more accurate than it sounds. Carbon that was buried and frozen and biologically dead for tens of thousands of years is waking up, coming back into the living chemistry of the ocean. And the organisms living in the Arctic seafloor, the bacteria and archaea and mould and worms and small invertebrates that make up the biological community of the sediment, they are consuming this ancient carbon, processing it, releasing its energy, and in doing so, proud, they are changing the chemistry of the water above them, and the atmosphere above that. All of this happening beneath the Arctic ice, all of this happening in the dark. All of this part of the same system that includes the shadow-fixing bacteria and the Polaris vents and the Freya methane mounds and the Greenland shark drifting slowly through ancient water. All of it connected. All of it one enormous conversation between ice and ocean and seafloor and atmosphere. Conversation that has been going on for millions of years, and that is now, in the span of a human lifetime, being interrupted. But there is something else on the Arctic shelves. Something that connects this story not just to science, but to the older and stranger parts of human knowing. The indigenous peoples of the Arctic, the Inuit, the Yupik, the Inupiat, the Chukchi, the many nations of people who have lived at the edge of the Arctic Ocean for thousands of years, they have known for generations that the sea beneath the ice is alive in ways that science is only now confirming. Their knowledge systems, built not on scientific instruments, but on generations of careful observation and accumulated experience, described the behaviours of seals and whales and walruses and fish in ways that pointed to a rich and complex ecosystem beneath the ice long before any researcher sent a remotely operated vehicle down to look. The ringed seal, which is perhaps the most important prey animal in the traditional Arctic food system, spends its winters in the water beneath the ice, breathing through holes it maintains by scratching through the ice with its claws. It dives deep, regularly, to hunt the fish and invertebrates living in the dark water below. The Inuit hunters who pursued ringed seals for thousands of years, learned to read the ice, to find the breathing holes, to understand the seal's relationship to the water beneath it. And in doing so, they learned things about the structure and life of the ice world that science only recently began to systematically document. Traditional Inuit ecological knowledge describes changes in where seals and walruses and whales are found, changes in their behaviour, changes in the timing of their seasonal movements that align with extraordinary precision with what oceanographers are now measuring, using sophisticated instruments. The animals were telling the story of the changing ocean. The hunters who watched those animals for centuries were recording it. And we were not listening. We are starting to listen now, and what the combination of traditional knowledge and modern science is revealing about the world beneath the Arctic ice is richer and stranger and more urgently important than either source of knowledge could produce alone, because the animals that the Inuit and other Arctic peoples have watched for thousands of years are themselves windows into the under-ice world. The narwhal, with its extraordinary spiral tusk that extends up to 3 meters from its upper jaw, dives routinely to depths of over 1,500 meters beneath the Arctic ice, hunting Greenland, halibut, and squid in the dark water. Each narwhal is essentially a living probe, descending into parts of the Arctic Ocean that no human instrument has mapped, navigating by sound and by senses we do not fully understand, moving through ecosystems we cannot yet see. The beluga whale, which the Inuit call the sea canary for its extraordinary range of vocalizations, uses sound to navigate beneath the ice in total darkness, producing clicks and whistles that bounce off the underside of the ice and off the seafloor, and off the bodies of other animals in the water, building a three-dimensional sound map of the under-ice world that is more detailed and more real-time than anything human technology can currently produce. The beluga knows the shape of the Arctic Ocean floor in regions we have never surveyed. It knows where the fish concentrate, where the cold currents run, where the warm Atlantic water pushes up, where the ice is thin enough to breathe through, carries a map of the under-ice world in its brain. A map built over a lifetime of dives. A map we cannot read. What a remarkable thought that is, to know that the most detailed, real-time knowledge of the world beneath the Arctic ice does not exist in any laboratory or database or scientific publication. It exists in the minds of narwhals and belugas and ringed seals and Greenland sharks, stored in the neural patterns of animals that have been navigating these waters for millions of years, and whose knowledge is encoded in behavior rather than language and will never be directly transferred to us. We can watch them. We can follow them. We can attach tiny sentences to their backs and record their dives and map their movements. And from those second-hand accounts, from those translated glimpses, we can begin to infer the shape of the world they know directly. But we cannot know it as they know it. We can only approach it asymptotically, getting closer with every study, with every improved sensor, with every refined analysis, but never quite arriving. And that gap, that irreducible gap between our knowledge and the knowledge embedded in the bodies and behaviours of the animals living beneath the Arctic ice, is one of the most extraordinary things about this story. Science is brilliant. Science is remarkable. Science has revealed wonders beneath the Arctic ice that would have seemed like mythology a generation ago. But the animals got there first, always been there first. And they carry information about this world that we are still learning to ask for. Host. As this second chapter of our journey draws toward its end, let us return to the question of the Atlantic water layer, because there is something about it that connects everything we have explored in this part of the story into a single thread of understanding. The Atlantification of the Arctic, the warming and rising of the Atlantic water intrusion, is not just a physical oceanographic phenomenon. It is a biological one. It is an ecological one. It is changing where species live and how they interact. It is weakening the cold, fresh surface layer that the ice depends on. It is releasing ancient methane from the seafloor. It is restructuring the food web from the bottom up. It is carrying warm water species into ecosystems that evolved without them over millions of years. And it is doing all of this in a system that is simultaneously undergoing the most dramatic physical transformation it has experienced in human memory, the loss of the ice itself. Remove the ice and you remove the algae that grow on its underside. Remove the algae and you starve the copepods. Starve the copepods. And you collapse the food web that builds upward from them to fish and seals and whales. Change the temperature and salinity of the surface layer. And you change which species can survive there. Change the chemistry of the deep water by releasing zombie carbon from thawing permafrost. And you change the organisms living in the sediment. Warm the Atlantic water intrusion, and you bring new species into collision with old ones in the dark. Part of this system is connected to every other part. Every change cascades. And the cascade is happening right now, tonight, while the Arctic Ocean hot and does what it has always done, its dark water slowly, circling its ancient currents, building and losing ice with the seasons, sustaining its vast invisible life in the cold and the dark. What hides beneath the Arctic ice is not just a list of species, or a catalogue of geological features, or a collection of remarkable discoveries. It is a system. It is a relationship. It is a conversation between ice and ocean and life and time that has been going on, uninterrupted, for longer than we can truly conceive. And we are only beginning to understand the vocabulary. But in part 3, we will go somewhere in this story that will change the texture of everything. Because there is something beneath the Arctic ice that is not just biologically remarkable or oceanographically significant toss. There is something that connects the Arctic deep to the origins of life on Earth. Something that connects what lives beneath the ice right now to the question of how life began in the first place. Something that, when you understand it, makes the cold, dark water beneath the Arctic ice feel less like a remote corner of our world and more like the centre of the oldest story ever told. What that something is, and how it connects the frozen north to the very first living thing that ever existed on this planet, that is where we are going next. And between now and then, let the dark water hold you. Let the slow ancient current of the Arctic deep carry you. The narwhal's map drawn in sound and memory, and a million years of diving be the last image you carry into the quiet hours of this night, because the story is not finished. Not even close. And what comes next is the part that changes the whole meaning of what came before, beneath the Arctic ice. The oldest question life has ever asked is written in the chemistry of hydrothermal vents and frozen methane and ancient dark water. And the answer, if there is one, may have been sitting under the ice at the top of the world. Since, before the first cell ever divided on this planet, you are listening to Depth Unseen. Where light ends, the story begins. Tonight we continue our descent, deeper than we have gone before, into the world that hides beneath the Arctic ice, into the part of the story where science and the origin of all things on Earth converge in the cold, the dark. When we left the second part of our journey, we were drifting in the narwhal's map. We had travelled through the Atlantic water layer, that ghost river of warmth, threading northward under the cold Arctic surface, reshaping everything it touches. We had descended into the ancient dark of the Arctic bottom water, into the world of the Greenland shark. 500 years old, drifting through cold that most life on Earth cannot survive. We had stood on the Arctic continental shelves above thawing permafrost releasing zombie carbon from a world that ended 10,000 years ago. And we had arrived at a question that goes beyond biology, beyond oceanography, beyond the specific and particular details of the Arctic system. How did life begin? Not just in the Arctic, everywhere. On Earth. In the universe. The question that has haunted human thinking since the first human being looked up at the stars and asked what they were, and why they were there, and whether whatever made them also made us. Tonight we are going to follow that question into the dark water beneath the Arctic ice. Because the answer, or at least the most compelling clue we currently possess, lives down there. It has been living down there, and understanding it changes the way the entire Arctic deep ocean feels, changes its weight and its significance, transforms it from a remote frozen corner of our planet into something that sits very close to the centre of everything. Let us begin with what we know about how life might have started. For most of the 20th century, the dominant scientific idea about the origin of life was what is called the primordial soup hypothesis. The idea proposed in various forms by scientists, including Charles Darwin, and later formalised by Alexander Oparin and J.B.S. Haldane in the 1920s, was that the early Earth had an ocean full of simple chemical compounds, amino acids and sugars, and the precursors of the molecules we now recognise as the building blocks of living things, and that in this warm, shallow sea, bathed in sunlight and struck by lightning and energised by heat and ultraviolet radiation, these compounds slowly assembled themselves into more and more complex structures. Until eventually, across enormous spans of time, something appeared that could replicate itself. Something that could copy its own chemical instructions and pass them on. The first living thing, primordial soup. A warm, sunlit, lightning-struck chemical cauldron where life was cooked into being. It is a compelling idea. It has inspired decades of research and many remarkable experiments. Most famously the Miller-Urey experiment of 1952, in which Stanley Miller and Harold Urey mixed simple gases, representing the early atmosphere, ran electricity through them to simulate lightning, produced amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, within days. Life's ingredients appearing in a flask, an extraordinary result. But there is a problem with the primordial soup. Several problems, actually. The early Earth's atmosphere and ocean chemistry, as we have come to understand it better, does not match the conditions that the primordial soup pollutes requires very well. Reactions that produce complex organic molecules in sunlit surface waters also tend to break them down again just as fast. Concentrations needed to drive the chemistry high of life would be difficult to maintain in an open ocean that is constantly mixing and diluting. And there is no clear mechanism by which a warm, sunlit, shallow sea provides the energy needed to drive the specific chemical reactions that build the molecular machinery of a living cell. The primordial soup has problems. Good ideas have problems. Science exists to find the problems and then find something better. And then in 1977, something happened that changed everything. The deep sea hydrothermal vents were discovered. We mentioned this in part 1, but now we are going to go much deeper into what it means. Vents discovered in 1977 along the Pacific Ocean, Galapagos Rift in the Pacific Ocean, were the first confirmation of something that had been theorized but never seen. places on the seafloor where the Earth's internal heat vents directly into the ocean through cracks in the crust, producing superheated water rich in minerals and chemicals, surrounded by ecosystems that require no sunlight whatsoever. Life fed by the heat of the Earth itself. Life that answers to chemistry and not to the sun. This discovery did not just add a new ecosystem to the catalogue of life on Earth, it reframed the entire question of where life could exist and where it might have originated. Because if life can exist and thrive in total darkness, or in water, at extreme temperatures and pressures, using chemosynthesis rather than photosynthesis, then the sunlit surface of the early Earth is no longer the only candidate for the birthplace of life. The deep sea floor, in the dark, around the heat of the Earth's interior, becomes a candidate. A very strong one. And in the decades since 1977, the case for the deep sea origin of life has grown enormously. A specific type of hydrothermal vent system called a lost city vent system, first discovered in the Atlantic Ocean in 2000, has become the most compelling candidate yet for the environment in which life on Earth first arose. Lost city vents are different from the black smoke events, first discovered in 1977. They are not roaring with superheated water at 400 degrees. They operate at gentler temperatures, between 40 and 90 degrees Celsius. They produce not acidic, mineral-heavy water, but alkaline water. Water with a high pH, rich in hydrogen gas and methane, within a rock formation called serpentinite that creates tiny, porous chambers in the seafloor, microscopic caves and channels in the rock, each one a miniature chemical reactor. In these tiny, porous chambers, the chemistry is extraordinary. Hydrogen molecules from the vent water react with carbon dioxide, dissolved in the surrounding ocean water. Reaction produces simple organic molecules. More reactions build on those. Porous structure of the serpentinite rock provides a surface for these molecules to concentrate and react on, solving the dilution problem that plagues the primordial soup. The temperature is warm enough to drive chemistry, but not so hot that it destroys the products. The alkaline conditions create a pH gradient, a difference in acidity between the inside of the rock chambers and the outside ocean water, and that gradient, that chemical difference across a thin mineral boundary, is essentially the same kind of energy gradient that every living cell on Earth uses to power itself today. Every living cell, from bacteria to human beings. The energy currency of all life on Earth is a molecule called ATP, and it is produced by exploiting a gradient of hydrogen ions across a membrane. The mitochondria in your cells right now, tiny structures producing the energy that keeps your heart beating and your brain dreaming, doing so by maintaining a difference in hydrogen ion concentration across a thin membrane, and using that difference to drive the chemistry of life. You are powered by a gradient. You have always been powered by a gradient. Every living thing on Earth is powered by a gradient. The Lost City vents produce exactly that kind of gradient, naturally, without any biological machinery. Create it. The rock itself creates it. Geology creates it. The chemistry of seawater, meeting the chemistry of serpentinite rock, creates a proton gradient that is, in structure and function, almost identical to the gradient that powers every living cell. This is not a small coincidence. This is not an interesting parallel. This is, according to researchers including Nick Lane at University College London and Mike Russell at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the most compelling evidence we have that life on Earth did not begin in a warm, sunlit pond or a lightning-struck ocean, began in the dark, in tiny rock chambers, on the alkaline hydrothermal seafloor, where the chemistry of the Earth's interior met the chemistry of the ancient ocean, in a gradient that was, essentially, already alive before life existed. Life did not emerge into the dark. Life was born in the dark, in conditions that the deep seafloor of the Arctic Ocean right now, with its hydrothermal systems and its ancient cold water, and its rock chemistry, partially echoes and preserves. Now let us make the connection explicit, because this is the heart of why the Arctic deep ocean is not just important as an ecosystem or as a climate system or as a repository of undiscovered species. It is important as a living library of the conditions in which life on Earth may have first appeared. The Polaris hydrothermal system at the top of the world, the northernmost seafloor hydrothermal field ever documented, produces water unusually rich in hydrogen and methane. Hydrogen and methane, the same gases that the Lost City vents in the Atlantic produce, the same gases that the alkaline vent hypothesis for the origin of life depends on. In a geological and chemical sense, Polaris vents are relatives of the Lost City system, kin to the conditions in which, if the most compelling current scientific hypothesis is correct, the first living thing on Earth began. We do not know yet whether the Polaris vents have the same porous serpentinite structure as Lost City. We do not know yet whether the same proton gradient conditions exist there. The surveys have been limited. The access has been difficult. The ice above makes investigation enormously complex and expensive and slow. But the chemical signature is there. The hydrogen richness is there. Methane is there. And in the dark water around those vents, organisms have been found that belong to the deepest, ancient branches of the Tree of Life. The Tree of Life is the way scientists represent the evolutionary relationships between all living things on Earth. At its base, at its trunk, are the most ancient lineages, the organisms whose ancestors diverged from the common ancestor of all life, earliest in the history of the planet. These deepest branches include the archaea, domain of microscopic life, distinct from bacteria and from all the complex cells that make up plants and animals and fungi. The archaea are ancient beyond imagining. They predate the evolution of complex cells by more than 1 billion years. Some of them live in conditions so extreme that they were not discovered until we began exploring environments, like hydrothermal vents and deep seafloor sediments, boiling water, highly acidic or alkaline conditions, no oxygen, complete darkness, poot. These are the environments that archaea thrive in. These are the conditions in which the deepest branches of the Tree of Life feel at home. The Arctic seafloor, the ancient cold sediment and the hydrothermal worm vent systems, and the deep water of the Arctic basin, is full of archaea, full of organisms from the deepest and oldest branches of the Tree of Life, full of living things that are more closely related to the first living cells on Earth than to anything visible to the naked eye. In 2015, researchers from Uppsala University in Sweden made a discovery in hydrothermal sediment from the Loki's Castle hydrothermal vent field, located on the mid-Atlantic ridge between Greenland and Norway, at the edge of the Arctic system. From the sediment around these vents, they extracted genetic material, the chemical instructions that cells use to build and run themselves, and they found sequences that belonged to an entirely new lineage of archaea, unlike anything previously documented. They named them Lokiarchaeota, after Loki's castle, the vent field where they were found. And what these genetic sequences revealed was breathtaking. Lokiarchaeota are not just a new species. They are a new branch on the Tree of Life, branch that sits precisely between the archaea and the domain that includes all complex life on Earth. The domain called Eukaryota, which includes every plant and animal and fungus and protist that has ever lived, including you. Including everything with a cell that has a nucleus. Including everything complex enough to see without a microscope. Including, in other words, everything we tend to mean when we say life. For decades, the evolution of complex cells, the jump from the simple cells of bacteria and archaea to the nucleus-containing cells of all complex life, one of the greatest mysteries in all of biology. It happened once. About 2 billion years ago, it changed the trajectory of life on Earth completely. Without that transition, there are no animals, no plants, no fungi, visible life of any kind, just bacteria and archaea forever. How did it happen? What lineage of archaea gave rise to the ancestral complex cell, Lokiarchaeota, found in the sediment of a hydrothermal vent system at the edge of the Arctic Ocean, appear to be the closest known relatives, the closest known living relatives of the ancestor of all complex life on Earth, found in the dark, in the sediment, around a hydrothermal vent in Arctic water. Subsequently, additional related lineages have been discovered in Arctic seafloor sediments: Thor, Thrarchaeota, Odinarchaeota, Heimdallarchaeota, all named for figures from Norse mythology, all found in and around Arctic hydrothermal systems, all belonging to a group now called the Asgard Archaea, after the realm of the gods in Norse legend, and all of them sitting in the genetic tree of life, closer to the origin of complex life on Earth than any other organisms yet found. The Arctic seafloor is not just a cold, dark place where strange creatures live. It is a living museum of the deepest history of life on Earth. Host. It is a place where organisms from the most ancient lineages, from the branches closest to the origin of everything complex and visible on this planet, still live, still function, still carry in their genetic material the faint signature of the transition that made animals and plants and fungi and ultimately us possible. In the cold, dark sediment beneath the Arctic ice, host, in water that has been circling the basin for centuries, without touching the surface, chemical conditions that echo the ancient hydrothermal seafloor, where life may have first appeared. The oldest relatives of the ancestor of all complex life are quietly going about their biology, eating, reproducing, exchanging genetic material, living the same kind of existence their ancestors lived 2 billion years ago, in conditions that have not changed dramatically enough to force them to change. They are time capsules. They are windows into a past so deep that it predates the existence of any multicellular organism that has ever lived. They are here right now, beneath the Arctic ice, doing what life does, and we almost did not know they existed. They were found not by a submersible with cameras, not by a diver. not by any visual observation at all. They were found by extracting sediment from the seafloor around a hydrothermal vent and sequencing the genetic material within it. A process called metagenomics, which is essentially the reading of all the genetic material in an environmental sample at once, like reading every book in a library simultaneously, rather than one at a time. The organisms themselves have never been seen. They have never been grown in a laboratory. They have never been photographed. Their existence is known only through their genetic signatures pulled from Arctic mud. We know they exist. We know roughly what genes they carry. We know from those genes what their metabolism is probably like, and what their relationship to the rest of the tree of life probably is. We have never seen them. Not one, not a single cell of a single Lokiarchean or Thorarchean has ever been directly observed by human eyes, and that is somehow the most extraordinary thing of all. The closest known living relatives of the ancestor of all complex life on Earth have been living beneath the Arctic ice for billions of years, and no human being has ever seen them. They are there right now, in the mud, in the cold, in the dark, carrying in their cells the genetic echo of the moment that made us possible. Let that settle for a moment. Let the weight of it be felt. You exist because, rough 2 billion years ago, an Archean very much like a Lokiarchean merged with a bacterium in conditions very much like the ones found around hydrothermal vents in deep, cold ocean water. And the result of that merger was the first complex cell, the ancestor of everything with a nucleus. The ancestor of every plant and every animal and every fungus that has ever lived on this planet, and the closest known living relatives of that Archean. The survivors of that ancient lineage living right now in the sediment beneath the Arctic ice. The Arctic is not a remote corner of the story of life on Earth. It may be very real and non-metaphorical sense. The place on Earth that is most intimately connected to the origin and the deep history of life itself, Prout. Not because life began there, necessarily, though the chemistry of its hydrothermal systems is consistent with the conditions in which life may have begun, but because it has preserved in its cold and dark and chemical stability the oldest living lineages, the branches that have been growing since near the beginning, the relatives of the ancestors, the asters. The Arctic Deep is a kind of library of time, and we are only just learning to read it. Now, let us follow this thread in a different direction, because the question of life's origin connects to another question that sits at the heart of everything we have been exploring, a question about the nature of life's boundaries, a question about what life is willing to do and where life is willing to go. The organisms discovered in and around Arctic hydrothermal systems and Arctic seafloor sediments belong to a category called extremophiles, which simply means lovers of extreme conditions. Organisms that have evolved to thrive in conditions that would destroy most other life. Heat extremophiles called thermophiles. Cold extremophiles called psychrophiles. Pressure extremophiles called pisophiles. Acid extremophiles called acidophiles. Salt extremophiles called halophiles. And organisms that combine multiple extremes that live in conditions that are simultaneously hot and acidic and high pressure, and chemically toxic by any measure that makes sense for surface life, called polyextremophiles. The Arctic deep is full of psychrophiles, organisms that have evolved specifically to function in near-freezing water, whose enzymes, the molecular machines that carry out the chemical reactions of life, tuned to work at temperatures that would cause most enzymes to stop functioning entirely. Most enzymes work best at moderate temperatures. They have an optimal temperature, and below it they become sluggish, and above it they unfold and break. The psychrophiles have evolved enzymes that work best at temperatures between 0 Hu and 15 degrees Celsius. Some of them function even in supercooled brine in the tiny channels of liquid water that persists within sea ice itself at temperatures as low as -20 or 30 degrees. As -20 or 30 degrees, where the extreme saltiness of the brine keeps it from freezing, even when the water around it is solid. Sea ice is not solid all the way through. It is threaded with tiny brine channels, microscopic passages of extremely salty liquid water, and in those channels, in conditions so extreme that they push against the very definition of what can support life. Microorganisms live. They have been found there. They have been studied. Their biology has been partially mapped, and they are extraordinary. These ice channel organisms represent one of the most extreme known habitats for life on Earth. The temperature is far below 0. The salinity is extreme, sometimes 10 times saltier than normal seawater. The space is microscopically tiny, perhaps booked. The availability of liquid water is marginal, dependent on the precise chemistry of the brine. The light that filters through the ice above is minimal, even in summer. And yet life is there. Bacteria, archaea, tiny algae, microscopic fungi, all adapted to conditions that should be impossible. All managing to carry out the essential processes of life, feeding, growing, reproducing, exchanging genetic material, in a space that is, by any standard measure, incompatible with life. This is what the Arctic ice teaches us, over and over, in every system and at every scale. Life does not define its boundaries by what we consider reasonable. Life defines its boundaries by what chemistry permits. And chemistry permits far more than intuition suggests. And this lesson, this fundamental lesson of the Arctic ice, the lesson that life will find a way to thrive in conditions that we declare incompatible with survival, is not just important for understanding the Arctic. It is important for understanding the universe, because if life can exist in the brine channels of Arctic sea ice, in conditions of near zero temperature and extreme salinity and minimal energy, input and maximum darkness, then the question of whether life exists elsewhere in the universe becomes not a matter of whether conditions elsewhere are hospitable enough, but a matter of whether chemistry works the same way everywhere. And chemistry does work the same way everywhere. The laws of chemistry are the laws of the universe. They do not change on Europa, the ice-covered moon of Jupiter, surface is swept by radiation and whose interior may contain a liquid water ocean beneath a frozen crust that bears a striking resemblance to the Arctic Ocean. They do not change on Enceladus, the moon of Saturn that erupts geysers of water vapour and organic molecules from cracks in its ice surface, suggesting a liquid ocean below, kept warm by the tidal forces of Saturn's gravity. They do not change on Titan, where seas of liquid methane and ethane sit beneath a dense orange atmosphere, and where chemistry, different from Earth's chemistry but chemistry nonetheless, creates complex organic molecules in conditions of extraordinary cold. When scientists design missions to look for life on these worlds, they look for conditions like those of the Arctic deep ocean. They look for liquid water in contact with rock. They look for chemical gradients. They look for heat sources that could drive chemistry. They look for the kind of conditions that we now know. From the study of places like the Polaris vents and the Loki's Castle vent field and the brine channels of Arctic sea ice are sufficient to support life. Or, if the alkaline vent hypothesis is correct, to create it. The Arctic deep ocean is not just a window into the history of life on Earth. It is a template for the search for life beyond Earth. It is the closest available analogue to the environments where life might exist or might have once existed on the moons of the outer solar system, and every discovery made in the dark water beneath the Arctic ice, every new organism found, and every new chemical process documented, every new ecosystem revealed by a retreating ice shelf adds detail and texture and credibility to the possibility that life in the universe is not miraculous exception it was once assumed to be. It is the rule. Life, as the Arctic teaches us, finds a way wherever chemistry permits it. Chemistry is patient. Chemistry is everywhere. Chemistry does not need sunlight or warmth or a comfortable pH or even oxygen. Chemistry just needs time and a source of energy and a surface to work on. And those things exist in more places in this universe than we once imagined. Beneath the Arctic ice, chemistry of life has been working for billions of years. Patient, persistent, utterly indifferent to our ignorance of it, living its ancient biology in the cold and the dark, producing the molecular signatures that we pull from the mud and read with instruments we invented a generation ago, and finding in those signatures the oldest story on Earth, older than multicellular life, older than the ozone layer, older than oxygen in the atmosphere, older than almost anything we can point to and say, this was here before. The Asgard Archaea were here before. In their genes is a record of a transition that happened 2 billion years ago and made everything complex about life on Earth possible. And they are here now, in the sediment, in the dark beneath the ice. Now, as this third chapter moves toward its close, let us return to the surface. Not all the way to the surface, but let us rise from the sediment and the ancient Archaea and the philosophical weight of origins thought, and look at something that is happening right now, in the present moment of the Arctic story, something that connects the ancient biology of the deep to the living, moving, visible world of the under-ice ecosystem, in a way that is both scientifically remarkable and deeply, personally astonishing when you truly understand it. There is a connection between the Asgard Archaea in the sediment and the ice algae on the underside of the ice above. It is not a direct connection, it is not a simple one, but it is real, and it illustrates something profound about how the Arctic system works as a whole. When the ice algae grow on the underside of sea ice during the spring bloom, when the sun returns to the Arctic and light begins to filter through the ice above, they grow in extraordinary quantities. A thick, rich, visible layer of algae on the underside of the ice, brown and gold and alive, consuming the nutrients in the water around them, and producing gonic organic material that cascades downward as the algae die and are eaten, and their remains sink slowly toward the seafloor. This cascade of organic material sinking from the underside of the ice to the seafloor below is called the biological pump. It is one of the fundamental processes by which carbon fixed by photosynthesis is transported from the surface to the deep, where it can be stored for long periods, and at the seafloor, the Asgard archaea and their microbial companions are waiting. They consume the organic material arriving from above. They process it. They incorporate it into their own cells and into the chemistry of the sediment. They are the final step in the biological pump. They are the destination. And in consuming the carbon from the ice algae above, they complete a loop, a cycle. A conversation between the underside of the ice and the deepest sediment of the ocean floor. Conversation that moves carbon from the surface world into the deep world, in a process that has been happening every year for as long as ice has existed in the Arctic. The ice algae and the archaea are connected, probably been connected for hundreds of millions of years. They are species apart of the same story. The most visible life in the Arctic, the algae bright on the underside of the ice, and the most invisible life, the archaea in the sediment, so deep and small that we can only detect their existence through their genetic signatures. They are in relationship. They are part of the same cycle, the same system, the same vast, patient, ancient conversation between ice and ocean and life and time. And it is this conversation, this system, this cycle, that is now under pressure from the changes sweeping the Arctic. Because if the ice retreats, the ice algae bloom changes. If the ice algae bloom changes, the biological pump changes. If the biological pump changes, carbon that reaches the seafloor changes. If the carbon input to the sediment changes, the microbial communities there, the archaea, the bacteria, the entire deep benthic ecosystem changes. And the changes cascade in both directions, upward and downward through every level of the system. The Arctic is one thing, not many separate things arranged by depth. One thing, and it is changing. In next part, we are going to go to the place where that change is most dramatic and most visible. We are going to follow the ice to its edge, to the marginal ice zone, the boundary where solid ice meets open ocean, and explore the extraordinary, volatile, explosive biology that happens there. The place where the Arctic shows its most dynamic face, place where spring arrives like an explosion of life after months of absolute cold, place where whales and birds and fish and plankton and predators of every kind converge on the edge of the melting ice, drawn by a pulse of life so intense it can be detected from space. And in that convergence, in that explosion of visible life at the edge of the ice, we'll find something that ties together everything we have explored, Xlound. The algae and the archaea, the vents and the sharks, the narwhals and the Asgard lineages, and the Atlantic water layer, and the zombie carbon, and the brine channels, and the shadow fixers, and the methane mounds into a single picture of a world that is more astonishing, more alive, more ancient, more important, and more urgently in need of understanding than anything in our experience of it from the surface has ever suggested. For now, let the cold of the Arctic sediment hold you. Let the idea of organisms carrying in their genes, the memory of the transition that made complex life possible, move through your thoughts like water through dark rock. Let the patience of it reach you. 2 billion years of patience, 2 billion years of quiet biology in the cold, and the dark, and somewhere in that patience, the beginning of everything you are, patience is still down there. Right now, beneath the Arctic ice, waiting as it always has, without waiting for anything at all, beneath the Arctic ice. Beneath the Arctic ice, the edge of everything begins where the solid white world ends and the open ocean begins. A line so alive, so explosive with biology, that it rewrites everything you thought you knew about what cold and darkness can produce. Tonight, we are going to stand at that edge together and watch the Arctic show its most astonishing face. You are listening to Depth Unseen, where light ends, the story begins. Tonight, we continue our descent into the world that hides beneath the Arctic ice, and in this fourth chapter, we rise from the ancient sediment and the deep Archaea and the hydrothermal dark, and we travel to the boundary, to the marginal ice zone, where the most explosive pulse of life on the planet happens every year in silence and in cold. When we left the third part of our journey, we were in the sediment. We were with the Asgard Archaea, those ancient microscopic organisms whose genes carry the faint chemical memory of a transition that happened 2 billion years ago and made complex life on Earth possible. We had traced the connection between the ice algae on the underside of the ice above and the Archaea in the sea floor below, following the biological pump as it moved carbon from the sunlit edge of the frozen world into the deepest and oldest parts of the ocean. Bulls. We had understood for the first time, perhaps, that the Arctic is not many separate things arranged by depth, but one single vast and patient system, conversation between ice and ocean and life and time that has been going on longer than anything we can easily imagine. Now we rise, not all the way to the surface. Not yet, but we rise from the sediment up through the water column, past the ancient bottom water, circling in its centuries-long gyre, past the Atlantic water layer, with its ghostly warmth and its arriving species, past the underside of the ice, and its coating of brown-gold algae. And we travel horizontally now, outward from the permanent ice pack, toward the edge, toward the boundary where everything changes. The marginal ice zone. Say those words to a marine biologist and watch their face change. Because the marginal ice zone is not just a geographic boundary between ice and open water. It is something else entirely. It is one of the most biologically productive environments on the surface of this planet, a place where the melting of ice creates conditions so rich in nutrients and so flooded with light in spring that life responds with an urgency that borders on violence. An explosion of biology that begins at the very first moment of spring, when the sun returns to the Arctic sky after months of darkness. And that builds and builds and builds until it can be seen, its signature of green and blue and white, from satellites orbiting 400 kilometers above the Earth. To understand the marginal ice zone, you have to understand what the melting ice does to the water below it. When sea ice melts in spring, it releases the fresh water it has been holding. Fresh water is less dense than salt water. It floats, it creates a thin layer of low density, cold, fresh water on the surface of the ocean at the ice edge, and this thin, fresh layer does something remarkable. It stabilizes the water column, prevents the mixing of surface water with the deeper, denser water below, and in doing so, traps something precious at the surface where the sun can reach it. Nutrients. The Arctic water column is not uniformly rich in nutrients at every depth. The deep water carries nutrients accumulated over centuries, but in the permanently ice-covered Central Arctic, those come and are largely inaccessible to the photosexables, to the photosynthetic talc organisms that need sunlight to use them. When winter ends and the ice begins to melt at the margins, the meltwater stratification traps a layer of nutrient-rich water close to the surface in the sunlit zone, exactly where the algae and phytoplankton need it to be. And then the sun comes back, and then the light hits that nutrient-rich, stratified, shallow surface layer. And then everything happens at once. Phytoplankton bloom at the Arctic ice edge is one of the great explosive events of biology on this planet. In a matter of days, sometimes hours, the surface water at the marginal ice zone turns green. Microscopic algae, each one a single cell, each one invisible to the naked eye, multiply in numbers that strain the imagination. A single phytoplankton cell can divide every day under good conditions. 1 becomes 2, 2 become 4, 4 become 8. After 30 doublings, which can happen in a month of good spring conditions, 1 cell has become more than 1 billion descendants. Multiply that by the trillions of cells that exist at the start of the bloom, and the numbers become the kind of figures that only make sense as colours on yours. On a satellite image, vast swathes of turquoise and green spreading across the surface of the ocean at the ice edge. From space, the Arctic ice edge in spring looks alive, because it is. But because it is more alive, more suddenly, more intensely alive, than almost any other place on Earth at that moment, bloom is visible from orbit. Its colours spread across hundreds of kilometres of ocean surface. Its oxygen output, byproduct of photosynthesis happening in those billions and trillions of cells, is detectable in the atmosphere. It is, in the most literal sense, one of the lungs of the Earth breathing. And it all begins with the melt of Arctic sea ice. Now think about what that means. It means in the context of everything we have learned. The ice is not just a frozen ceiling over a mysterious dark world. The ice is the engine of the most explosive biological event in the ocean. Its melt, its seasonal retreat from the margins of the Arctic basin, the trigger for a cascade of life that feeds everything above and below. The phytoplankton bloom feeds the zooplankton. The zooplankton feed the fish. The fish feed the seals. The seals feed the polar bears and the orca and the Greenland sharks. The dead phytoplankton and zooplankton that zooplankton sink from the bloom feed the copepods and the krill and eventually the benthic communities on the seafloor. The archaea and bacteria in the sediment, all the way down to the organisms we were sitting with. One bloom, one explosive spring event at the edge of the melting ice. And it reverberates through every level of the entire Arctic ecosystem, from the atmosphere above to the sediment below, from the polar bear on the ice surface to the Greenland shark 500 meters down in the dark. Marginal ice zones is the heartbeat of the Arctic. It beats once a year, and everything is timed to it. Bowhead whale arrives at the ice edge in spring to feed on the blooming zooplankton. The bowhead is another extraordinary animal, one that deserves to be understood rather than simply listed. It is the longest-lived mammal on Earth. Individual bowhead whales have been found with stone harpoon tips from weapons made in the early 19th century, embedded in their blubber, poons. harpoons that missed their mark 200 years ago and have been slowly encased in fat ever since. Bowheads regularly live to be over 100 years old. Some estimates, based on chemical analysis of their eye tissue, suggest individuals of 150 to 200 years or more, bowhead whale alive today, may have been born before the American Civil War, before the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, before the invention of the telephone. It has been swimming to the ice edge every spring for a century and a half, following the bloom, feeding on the krill and copepods that appear. At the moment, the ice begins to melt, navigating the Arctic Ocean with a sophistication that we are only beginning to measure with the satellite tags and acoustic sensors we attach to them. The bowhead navigates under the ice by producing calls that bounce off the underside of the ice and map its thickness and extent in real time. They have been recorded singing beneath the ice in winter, producing long, complex vocalizations that change over time, that are learned and modified and passed between individuals. That function, some researchers believe, something analogous to cultural transmission, information about the environment encoded in sound and shared between whales across generations. Bowhead knows the ice, has known it for hundreds of years, carries in its behaviour and its biology and its songs a record of the Arctic that predates any scientific observation, any satellite measurement, any instrument ever deployed in these waters. And the bowhead has been arriving at the marginal ice zone every spring for as long as there have been bowhead whales, which is a very long time, but the marginal ice zone is not just for the whales. Every level of the food web responds to the spring bloom with an urgency that reflects the scarcity of the Arctic winter and the abundance of this brief spring pulse. Millions of seabirds arrive at the ice edge from wintering grounds thousands of kilometres to the south. Little auks, thick-billed murres, northern fulmars, black-legged kittiwakes, all arriving in clouds of wings and noise to the edge of the melting ice, diving into the bloom-rich water, consuming krill and fish and small crustaceans with an intensity that reflects the compressed time available before the summer blooms, and then winter comes again. The little auk is particularly remarkable. A bird small enough to hold in one hand winters far out in the open North Atlantic and migrates in spring to the marginal ice zone and the coasts of Arctic islands to breed and feed. In a single day, a little auk will make hundreds of diving, foraging trips to feed its chick, each dive consuming krill and copepods in quantities that are extraordinary relative to the bird's size. Colony of little auks feeding at the ice edge in spring consumes quantities of zooplankton that rival the consumption of much larger predators. They do it in this narrow window, this brief explosion of biological productivity at the ice edge, and then they are gone back south before the darkness returns. Everything at the marginal ice zone is timed to the ice. Everything depends on the ice retreating at the right speed, at the right time of year, creating the right conditions for the bloom, producing the right stratification for nutrient trapping, generating the right food base for the zooplankton that feed the fish, that feed the birds, feed the bears, that feed the foxes, that feed on the eggs of the very birds that came to aid to the ice to feed on the fish. A chain a circle, conversation so intricately timed that any disruption propagates through every level. And the timing is changing. As Arctic sea ice retreats earlier in the year, as the marginal ice zone shifts northward, and the melt begins sooner than it historically did, biological calendar of the Arctic is being rewritten. The phytoplankton bloom happens earlier. The zooplankton, that time their life cycles to the bloom, have not fully adjusted. Fish, that time they're spawning to the zooplankton peak, have not fully adjusted. The seabirds that arrive at the ice edge on schedules shaped by thousands of generations of evolutionary pressure have not fully adjusted. Bowhead whale, arriving at the ice edge in spring after a journey of thousands of kilometers timed to the bloom, finding that the peak of productivity has shifted. This mismatch, this desynchronization of biological timing, in response to physical changes, called a phenological mismatch. And it is one of the most insidious consequences of the changing Arctic. It is not dramatic. It does not look like catastrophe from the outside. But it erodes the precision of the relationships that the Arctic food web depends on. It means that predators arrive when their prey are past their peak abundance. Chicks hatch when the insects and crustaceans they need for growth are less available than they were historically. That the margin for error, already thin in an environment as extreme as the Arctic, becomes thinner still. The bowhead whale can adapt over generations because its lifespan is long enough to observe multiple years of change, and its intelligence is sufficient to adjust its behaviour in response. A species whose entire life cycle completes in one season, an annual plant, a migratory insect, a seabird that raises one chick per year, far less flexibility. The margin for error is its survival. Now let us go beneath the surface of the bloom and into the water column at the marginal ice zone, because what happens underwater during the spring bloom is as extraordinary as what happens at the surface. Crowd a host, and it connects back to everything we've been exploring in the deep. As the phytoplankton bloom in the surface water are consumed by zooplankton, primarily copepods and krill, which in turn are consumed by fish and larger invertebrates. But not all the phytoplankton are consumed in the surface layer. A significant fraction sinks. As phytoplankton cells die, they aggregate into marine snow, which is exactly what it sounds like. A gentle, perpetual downfall of organic particles, dead algae and fecal pellets and mucus, and the debris of the bloom drifting slowly downward through the water column in a constant white rain. Marine snow is the vehicle of the biological pump. It is the mechanism by which the carbon fixed in the surface by photosynthesis is transported to deep. And in the Arctic, at the marginal ice zone in spring, the marine snow falls in quantities and concentrations that are extraordinary. The seafloor beneath the ice edge bloom receives pulses of organic material that arrive weeks or months after the surface bloom, delayed delivery of spring abundance to the deep. A gift from the sunlit world to the dark one. The organisms waiting on some seafloor below the bloom know this gift is coming. They have been waiting all winter in the reduced metabolism of the cold. Sea cucumbers, which are animals related to starfish and sea urchins, move across the Arctic seafloor, consuming sediment and extracting organic material from it with a slow and patient thoroughness. When the marine snow arrives in spring, some of them have been observed to extend their feeding appendages upward into the water column, reaching for the falling particles rather than waiting for them to settle. A creature evolved for the seafloor, reaching upward for the rain from above, timed to the bloom, connected to the ice. Brittle stars cut sections of the Arctic seafloor in densities that are astonishing, hundreds of individuals per square metre in places, 5 slender arms extended in the current, to to catch suspended particles, living their entire existence in the cold dark, connected to the surface only through the rain of marine snow that falls from the bloom above. They live long lives, some species of brittle star reaching decades in age. They grow slowly, they reproduce slowly, and they are extraordinarily sensitive to changes in the timing and quantity of the marine snow that sustains them. In the deepest parts of the Arctic basin, the Amundsen Basin and the Nansen Basin, which together form the central deep Arctic Ocean at depths of over 4,000 metres, the seafloor communities are so dependent on the annual marine snow pulse from the ice edge bloom that researchers studying them can literally read the history of Arctic surface conditions in the thickness and composition of the sediment layers. Good bloom years leave a thick layer of organic rich material. Poor bloom years leave thin, carbon-poor layers. The history of the ice edge, the history of the spring bloom, the history of the Arctic surface is written in the sediment below, year by year, layer by layer, going back hundreds of thousands of years. The Arctic seafloor is a diary written in the language of marine snow, recording every year of ice and bloom and melt and freeze, going back to a time before our species existed. And the scientists who core that sediment extract columns of mud going back through geological time, can read that diary and understand what the Arctic surface was doing in years before any human observation, before any instrument, before any memory. What they find in that diary is a record of extraordinary stability punctuated by dramatic transitions. Long periods, thousands of years long, when the ice edge bloom was predictable and regular, and the marine snow fell in consistent quantities to the seafloor below, and then moments of rapid change, transitions that happened in geological terms almost instantaneously when the ice extent shifted dramatically, when the bloom location moved, when the chemistry of the surface water changed, the sediments of record below shows the change in the composition and quantity of the material raining down. We are in one of those transition moments right now, and the sediment record, when scientists read it 1,000 years from now, if any are in a position to do so, will show this moment as a sharp line. A boundary layer before it, the Arctic diary of the past 10,000 years, relatively stable, the Holocene record of a world in balance. After it, something different, a new chapter, a new chemistry, a new pattern of bloom and snow and ice and dark. What that new pattern will look like, what it will sustain and what it will not. What will flourish and what will not be able to adjust quickly enough. The question that thousands of researchers around the world are working to answer. The marginal ice zone is their laboratory. The sediment cores are their history books. The animals with satellite tags swimming through the changing water are their real-time sensors. and at the centre of all of it, doing what it has always done, retreating slightly further each year, thinning slightly each decade, the Arctic ice continues to define the system even as it diminishes. The ice is still there, it still forms every winter, it still creates the conditions for the spring bloom. It still provides the underside where the algae grow, and the amphipods swarm and the ringed seals maintain their breathing holes. It is still the ceiling of the entire world we have been exploring, but it is a thinner ceiling than it was, more seasonal ceiling. A ceiling that in some projections, based on current rates of warming and ice loss, may be gone entirely in summer within decades. What happens to the under-ice world when the ceiling is gone? What happens to the organisms that evolved specifically for the conditions beneath permanent Arctic sea ice? When the ice is no longer permanent, what happens to the ice algae bloom when there is no ice to grow on? What happens to the ringed seal when the ice it needs to give birth and to maintain breathing holes in winter is gone? These are not hypothetical questions for some distant future. Proud. They are questions being asked right now by researchers watching the changes unfold in real time, measuring them with instruments, but observing them in the behaviour of animals, reading the signs in the ice itself and in the water, below it, and in the sediment record being written even as we speak. And there is something else happening in the changing marginal ice zone that no one predicted. Something that is, in a strange way, beautiful and deeply complicated. As the Arctic ice retreats and the area of open ocean in summer grows, the phytoplankton bloom is expanding. Not just at the traditional marginal ice zone, but deeper into what was previously permanently ice-covered water, areas of the central Arctic that historically never experienced a surface bloom. Because they were always covered in ice, are now, in summer, exposed to sunlight for weeks or months. And in those newly open waters, phytoplankton are blooming. More bloom, more marine snow, more carbon transported to the deep, more food for the seafloor communities. At first consideration, this might sound like a benefit. More photosynthesis, more carbon drawn from the atmosphere and stored in the deep ocean. But it is more complicated than that, because the species of phytoplankton blooming in the newly open central Arctic are not the same species that historically dominated the marginal ice zone bloom. They are different species, arriving from lower latitudes, following the retreating ice northward. They produce different types of organic material. They sink at different rates. They are eaten by different zooplankton. They create different marine snow with different nutritional profiles. And the seafloor communities that have evolved over millions of years to consume the specific type of marine snow produced by the specific bloom. Historically, falling on them are being presented with something different, catastrophically different. Not overnight, but different, and in the cold, slow time of the deep Arctic, where organisms grow on timescales of decades and centuries, even gradual change can outpace adaptation. The ringed seal, the bowhead whale, brittle star on the seafloor, the copepod timing its life cycle to the bloom, the little auk arriving at the ice edge in spring, all in relationship with each other, all of them in relationship with each other, all of them in relationship with the ice, all of them part of the same ancient conversation, all of them, in their various ways, being asked to adjust to a world that is changing, faster than any of them have experienced in their evolutionary history. Some will adjust. Life is resilient in ways that continue to astonish. The shadow-fixing bacteria beneath the ice were a surprise because we assumed the conditions were not right for them. The Asgard Archaea were a surprise because we assumed the deep sediment was a simple place. Freya methane mounds were a surprise because we assumed we knew where the deepest cold seeps were. Every time we look at the Arctic and say, this cannot support what we think it supports, we are wrong. Life finds a way. But finding a way takes time, and the question of whether the time available matches the speed of change is the deepest uncertainty in all of Arctic science. In the marginal ice zone right now, tonight, as you lie here in the warm and the quiet sea, the edge of the Arctic ice is doing what it does in this season. The light is cycling through its long Arctic patterns. Phytoplankton bloom is happening somewhere along that edge, in some patch of newly stratified meltwater. Marine snow is falling from it through the water column below. A bowhead whale is moving through dark water toward the sound of its feeding ground. A little auk is diving into the bloom, its small wings beating water instead of air in pursuit of a copepod it cannot see. Ringed seal is surfacing through a breathing hole in ice that has been there all winter, but that, by next summer, may not be there at all. And on the seafloor below all of it, in sediment laid down year by year, for hundreds of thousands of years, the diary continues to be written, organic particles settling, chemistry changing, a record accumulating of a world in transition, and deeper still, cold ancient water of the Arctic bottom water. In the dark that does not change with seasons, in the temperature that does not change with years, the Greenland shark is drifting, 500 years old or more, moving at the pace of geology through water that was at the surface of the Arctic Ocean when Columbus was crossing the Atlantic, carrying in its ancient body the memory of the Arctic's long, stable past. Unbothered, unhurried, patient, in a way that makes human concern look like a brief flash of light in a very long darkness. The Greenland shark does not know that the world above it is changing. It does not know that the ice above the water above it is thinning. It does not know that the bloom at the ice edge is happening at a different time in a different place, producing different snow. It simply moves through its ancient water, hunting with a patience calibrated to a lifespan of centuries, as it has always done. But in the coming decades, as the changes at the surface cascade downward through the food web, through the marine snow, through the benthic communities, through every level of the system, those changes will reach even the deep water where the Greenland shark drifts. Changed chemistry, changed prey availability, changed oxygen levels. The cascade from the surface takes time to reach the deep, but it always arrives. What awaits in part 5, the final chapter of our journey, is the question of what comes next. Not just for the Arctic, not just for the organisms living beneath its ice, but for us, for our relationship to this world that we have only just begun to understand, for the meaning of what hides beneath the Arctic ice, in the context of everything we know and everything we have yet to learn. There is something in the final chapter that we have not yet addressed. Something that has been present throughout this entire journey, threading through every discovery, every ancient organism, every bloom and vent and shark and singing whale. something about what the Arctic means, what it says about the nature of our planet and our place on it. What it asks of us, if we are willing to hear the question. Something is not a fact. It is not a species or event or a chemical process. It is a feeling, a recognition, Proust, an understanding that arrives not from data, but from the accumulation of all the data we have gathered tonight, all the astonishment and the weight and the patience and the complexity and the age of what lives beneath the Arctic ice. It arrives quietly, like something that has always been true, finally making itself known in the dark. In next part, we will arrive there together, in the slowest and most deliberate part of the journey. In the part where the story begins to settle into stillness, where the questions give way to something larger than questions, where the darkness beneath the Arctic ice stops being a mystery to be solved, and becomes something else entirely, something more like home. For now, let the marginal ice zone hold you. Let the marine snow drift through your thoughts. Let the bowhead song move through cold water in the dark. Let the little auk dive, for the last time tonight, and fold its wings, and settle on the surface of a sea that reflects nothing but stars. The Arctic is not done with us. One chapter remains, and it is the one that changes the way everything else we have learned tonight feels, beneath the Arctic ice, at the end of every question and the beginning of every silence. There is something that does not have a name yet, something that science has approached from every direction and touched, only at its edges, something ancient and patient and profoundly indifferent to our urgency. And tonight, in this final chapter, we are going to sit with it together until we understand not just what it is, but what it means. You are listening to Depth Unseen. Where light ends, the story begins. Tonight we complete our journey into the world beneath the Arctic ice, world that has lived and breathed and changed and endured in darkness for longer than our species has existed. And we bring the story home. Host. When we left the fourth part of our journey, we were at the marginal ice zone. We had watched the spring bloom explode at the edge of the melting ice, that annual eruption of biology visible from space. We had followed the marine snow drifting downward through the water column, falling on seafloor communities that have evolved over millions of years to receive it. We had sat with the bowhead whale, 2 centuries old, singing beneath the ice in a language we cannot read. We had walked the Arctic as a diary, layer by layer, sediment by sediment, record of a world in transition, written in organic particles on a cold, dark floor. And we had arrived at the edge of the largest question of all: what hides beneath the Arctic ice? We know now, in broad and astonishing terms, what is there: bacteria and archaea, and ancient sharks, and singing whales, and hydrothermal vents, and methane cathedrals, and the oldest living relatives of the ancestor of all complex life on Earth. The question now is different. The question now is what it means. And to answer that, we have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of this journey. Not the beginning of our relationship with the dark. Human beings have always been afraid of the dark. Not just physically afraid, not just the animal instinct that keeps children from wandering from the fire at night, but philosophically afraid, existentially afraid. The dark has represented, in every human culture that has ever existed, the unknown. The absence, place beyond the boundary of what can be seen, and therefore what can be known, and therefore what can be controlled. We have spent the entirety of our technological history pushing back the dark, building fires, lighting torches, stringing electric lights along every road and through every building until some places on Earth have forgotten what true darkness looks like. We have been, as a species, engaged in a long war against the dark, and the Arctic ice is the dark's last great stronghold on this planet, not because it is literally dark, though it is, for months at a time, as dark as anything on Earth, but because it is opaque, because it seals away from us, with its thickness and its cold and its remoteness. A world that we cannot see or touch or easily reach. It has resisted our instruments and our curiosity and our need to know. It has kept its secrets better than almost any other place on this planet, Pot. It has been, for all of human history, the most persistent edge of the unknown. And what we have found, every time we have managed to penetrate that edge, is not absence, not the cold emptiness, not the cold nothing that our fear of the dark whispers to us. What we have found is life. Life in every form, life at every depth, life in conditions that should not permit it, life older than anything we can easily imagine. Life carrying in its genes the history of our own origins. Life singing songs in the dark that predate human language by millions of years. Every discovery beneath the Arctic ice has been a revision of a limit we had drawn too small. Every time we have said, nothing can live there, we have been wrong. Every time we have said, we understand this system, something new has emerged from the dark to complicate that understanding. The Arctic ice has been, for as long as we have been paying attention, a teacher of humility. And tonight, in this final chapter, that is what I want you to carry. Not a list of species, not a catalogue of chemical processes or geological features, not even the astonishment of the Greenland shark, or the Asgard Archaea, or the Methane cathedrals, or the Bowhead's song. Those things are all real, and they are all extraordinary, and they deserve to live in your memory. But the deeper thing, the thing underneath all the facts, is this. We do not know as much as we think we do. About the ocean, about life, about the limits of what is possible, about the boundaries of what exists beyond the edges of our instruments and our expeditions and our models. And the Arctic ice, more than any other place on Earth, has been demonstrating that to us. Repeatedly, patiently, without judgment, for as long as we have been looking. Let us go to one more place before we let the night settle around us completely. One more discovery, host, one more door opened into a room we did not know was there. In 2023, researchers working in the waters beneath the Arctic Ocean made observations that have been accumulating significance ever since. They found in the water column beneath the permanent sea ice of the central Arctic, in the middle of winter, in conditions of complete darkness and near freezing temperature, evidence of active photosynthesis. Not from sunlight, there is no sunlight there, but from a different source of light entirely, bioluminescence. Bioluminescence is the production of light by living organisms. It is common in the deep ocean. Firefly squid, anglerfish, dinoflagellates that glow blue-green when disturbed in warm tropical water. Jellyfish that pulse with cold blue light in the dark. Bioluminescence is one of the ocean's most widespread and least understood phenomena. An estimated 76% of deep-sea animals produce their own light. The deep ocean is, in the darkest places on Earth, full of living light, and what the researchers found in the Arctic was something extraordinary, as extraordinary even by those standards. certain species of sea ice algae, the darkness beneath the winter ice, were performing a form of photosynthesis driven not by sunlight, but by the bioluminescent flashes of plankton in the water around them. The zooplankton, disturbed by predators or by movement, produced brief flashes of blue-green light. The algae in the darkness were capturing those flashes and using them to drive a low-level photosynthetic process. Life using the light produced by other life to feed itself in darkness. In a world with no sun, a closed loop of living light, an ecosystem that had, in some sense, found its own answer to the absence of sunlight. Not by waiting for the sun to return, not by shutting down until spring, but by using whatever light was available in the dark. Even if that light was produced by the living things around it. We do not fully understand this yet. The research is preliminary. The mechanism is not completely characterized. The extent to which this process contributes meaningfully, what, to Arctic winter productivity is still being measured and debated, but the existence of it, the discovery that life beneath the Arctic ice may have found a way to photosynthesize in complete darkness using bioluminescent light, consistent with everything else. The Arctic has taught us about the ingenuity of life in impossible conditions. Life does not stop in the Arctic winter. It does not wait. It does not go dormant and silent and empty. It adapts. It finds the available energy. It uses the light that is there, however faint, however strange, however unlike the light it was originally evolved to use. It continues in the brine channels, threading through winter sea ice. At temperatures of -20 degrees Celsius, psychrophilic bacteria continue their slow cold chemistry. In the sediment below, the archaea process whatever organic material the previous year's bloom left behind. In the deep water, the Greenland shark drifts. Bowhead moves through dark water, singing. The coppepods that descended to depth in autumn to wait out the winter on their stores of accumulated fat hang suspended in the dark water, their metabolism reduced to its minimum, their bodies waiting for the chemical signal that spring is coming. The ice is thinning, that the light above is returning. They wait without suffering, without impatience, without the weight of expectation that makes waiting difficult for us. They simply continue in the dark, in the cold, at the pace of the Arctic, which is slower and older and more patient than any pace we recognize as normal. There is something in that pace that I want you to feel right now, something that the Arctic offers to those who are willing to receive it. We live fast, all of us. Even in the quiet moments, even in the spaces between the noise of daily life, there is a speed to modern existence that has no equivalent in the natural world. Information arrives constantly. Demands accumulate. Time feels compressed, urgent, always running slightly ahead of where we are. The Arctic runs on a different clock. The Greenland shark aging 500 years in cold, dark water. Bowhead whale carrying centuries of Arctic memory in its body. The sediment laying down its diary of annual marine snow, year by year, building a record that will endure for geological time. The Asgard archaea in the seafloor sediment. Their metabolism so slow in the cold that a single cell division may take years, living in a biological time frame so different from ours, that calling us relatives of their ancient lineage feels almost metaphorical, almost too enormous to be literal. and yet it is completely, scientifically, demonstrably literal. We are their descendants, in the deepest sense available to biology. Every complex living thing on Earth, every animal and plant and fungus is descended from the merger that happened near organisms like those Asgard Archaea 2 billion years ago. Dark, cold water, not entirely unlike the water in which their relatives still live today. Cold, dark seafloor is not just where some interesting extremophiles live. It is, in the most direct biological sense available to us, where we come from. The darkness beneath the Arctic ice is not alien. It is ancestral. Let that be true for a moment. Let it be felt rather than just understood. Everything you are, the specific improbable arrangement of carbon and water and chemistry that experiences this moment, that hears these words and forms images from them, and feels the weight of the dark outside the window and the warmth of the quiet around you. Everything you are traces back through an unbroken chain of living things to that cold, dark sea floor where chemistry first organized itself into something that could copy its own instructions and call itself alive. You are the Arctic. Alive. In the most fundamental sense, the Arctic deep is not somewhere out there, remote and frozen and separate from you. It is your oldest address, place your ancestors came from. Before the concept of address existed, before the concept of ancestor existed, before the concept of concept existed. When the bowhead whale sings beneath the ice in the dark, it is singing in a voice that comes from the same lineage, the same ancient tree, the same original spark of chemistry in the cold, dark water. You and the bowhead whale are relatives. You and the Arctic cod with its antifreeze blood are relatives. You and the sea cucumber, reaching upward for marine snow, and the brittle star extending its arms in the cold current, and the ringed seal carving its breathing hole through ice are relatives. You and the Asgard Archaea in the sediment, whose ancestors were present at the transition that made your kind of life possible, are relatives of the most ancient kind. The Arctic is a family album, a very old one, from before photographs, from before language, written in genes and chemistry and the patient persistence of organisms in conditions that should not permit them. Now let the pace slow further. Let the words come more gently. Let the images drift like marine snow through the water column of the night. The Arctic ice, right now, doing what it always does in this season. The light above it has the quality of Arctic light, long and low and golden in the hours when it appears, thin and cold and honest in its illumination of a landscape that hides nothing from view except everything beneath its surface. The wind moves across the ice. The ice groans and shifts. The pressure ridges, long lines where ice flows have been pushed together and crumpled into frozen mountains, cast shadows in the low light that look like writing in a language no one has yet learned to read. Below the ice, in the first few meters of dark, cold water, the algae on the underside catch whatever light filters through the ice and do what they have always done. They photosynthesize. They make food from light. They feed the amphipods that feed the cod, that feed the seals, that feed the bears and the orcas, and the Greenland sharks, and eventually everything. Eventually the entire food web of the Arctic, in a long, slow cascade of energy, from the sun above the ice to the mud below the ocean. Deeper, the Atlantic water layer moves its ghost river of warmth northward. The temperature gradient, where it meets the cold surface water, concentrates life in invisible abundance. Copypods drift in their millions through cold, dark water that looks, to our instruments, like a living thing unto itself, a layer of biology hanging in the water column, like a cloud. Deeper still, the ancient bottom water circles its centuries-long gyre, cold and dense and old, carrying in its chemistry the signature of the surface conditions. From 200 years ago, from the time when the water now at the bottom was last, at the top, was last touched by wind and light, and the exchange of gases with the atmosphere above. And on the seafloor, in the sediment, the archaea are doing what they have always done. Slowly, patiently, in biological time so extended that a human lifetime is barely a moment in their history. They process the organic material arriving from above. They exchange electrons with the minerals in the sediment. They live, if the word live can be stretched to include something so stripped of urgency, motion, in the purest expression of patience that biology has ever produced. They have been there since before the ice existed. They will be there, in one form or another, long after the ice is gone. They do not require the ice. That they do not depend on the surface conditions that everything above them depends on. They draw their energy from the chemistry of the rock, and the sediment from ancient organic material, processes that connect them to the interior of the earth rather than to the sky. They are the floor of the story. The oldest page, first words. And we are one of the last. Human beings appeared on Earth approximately 300,000 years ago. In the context of the 4 billion year history of life, that is recent. Extraordinarily recent. The Asgard archaea have been on Earth for more than 6 times longer than complex life has existed, more than 13,000 times longer than our species. In the Library of Life's History on Earth, we are a very new book. The Arctic seafloor is the oldest section of the archive. This is not a small or incidental thing. It changes the way the Arctic feels, changes what its preservation or its loss means. When the Arctic ice retreats, we are not just losing a habitat. We are not just losing a carbon sink or a climate regulator or a biodiversity hotspot, though it is all of those things, and their loss matters enormously. We are losing pages from the oldest library on Earth. We are exposing to conditions they have never experienced in evolutionary history, organisms that carry in their genes the record of biologicals and relationships and biological innovations that took billions of years to accumulate. What is lost when a species feel that evolved in complete Arctic isolation, that has never in its evolutionary history encountered the chemistry or the competition or the temperature of a warming ocean? What is lost when that species cannot adapt quickly enough? We lose more than a species. We lose a lineage. We lose a branch on the tree of life that cannot be regrown. We lose the specific biology that lineage contained, specific proteins and mechanisms and innovations. That millions of years of evolution in the most extreme conditions on Earth produced. We lose something that will not come back. Not in any time frame that matters to anything that will call itself human. The Arctic is irreplaceable. Not in the sentimental way that everything beautiful feels irreplaceable when you are afraid of losing it. In the literal, biological, evolutionary sense, there is nowhere else on Earth with the combination of conditions that the Arctic provides. the cold, the ice, the darkness, the specific chemistry of Arctic seawater and Arctic sediment and Arctic hydrothermal systems. The organisms that evolved in those conditions are adapted to them and to nothing else. They cannot be moved somewhere safer. They cannot be preserved in a museum or a seed bank or a genetic archive in a way that restores their living function in the ecosystem they evolved within. They exist in relationship. The ice algae and the shadow-fixing bacteria and the coppepods and the Arctic cod and the ringed seal and the bowhead whale and the Greenland shark and the Asgard archaea and the brittle stars on the seafloor and the sea cucumbers reaching for marine snow and little orcs diving into the bloom at the ice edge and everything else that has not yet been named or found or even guessed at in the 80% of the Arctic seafloor we have not yet mapped. They exist in relationship to each other and to the specific conditions of the Arctic. Remove the conditions and the relationship collapse. The individual species may persist for a while. In reduced numbers, in marginal conditions, the system, the conversation, the vast, patient, ancient, interconnected whole that cannot be preserved in pieces. And yet we have not lost it. Not entirely. Not yet. The ice is still there, changed, thinner, more seasonal, less permanent than it was, but there. The algae are still on it. Underside, the archaea are still in the sediment. The bowhead is still singing. Greenland shark is still drifting in its ancient water. The spring bloom still explodes at the ice edge, still visible from space, still feeding everything, from the atmosphere above to the seafloor below. The story is still being told, the conversation is still happening, diary is still being written. And we are, for the first time in the history of our species, paying attention. We are paying attention in a way our ancestors could not. With instruments sensitive enough to detect individual molecules in Arctic seawater, genetic analysis powerful enough to read the evolutionary history of an organism. From a handful of sediment, satellites that watch the ice edge bloom from orbit and track its changes year by year, with remotely operated vehicles that descend to the Arctic seafloor and photograph creatures that have never been seen before, with the accumulated knowledge of indigenous Arctic peoples who have been paying careful attention to this system for thousands of years, and whose observations and warnings and intimacy with the ice constitute a kind of knowledge that our instruments cannot replicate. Host. We are the first generation of human beings with the tools to truly see what hides beneath the Arctic ice. And what we see, all its astonishment and complexity and ancient, patient beauty, is something worth protecting with every resource and every commitment and every act of attention that our species is capable of. Not because the Arctic needs us. It does not. It was here before us. And in its deep and patient biology, it will outlast whatever we do or fail to do in the span of our brief, noisy existence, but because we need it. Because the ice and what lies beneath it is part of the living system of this planet that sustains every condition that makes kind of life possible. Because the biological pump that carries carbon to the deep Arctic sediment is part of the system that regulates the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that determines the temperature at which we live, because the Arctic fresh water flowing into the ocean with melting ice is part of the ocean circulation system that moves heat around the planet and keeps the climates of the northern hemisphere stable enough for agriculture and civilization to function, because the organisms living beneath the Arctic ice produce and consume gases and nutrients that enter the global cycles of chemistry that every living thing on Earth depends on. The Arctic beneath the ice is not separate from us. It is connected to us in ways that are concrete and measurable and real. What happens there happens, eventually, everywhere. And what lives there, in all its extraordinary ancient complexity, is worth knowing, worth understanding, worth caring about, not just as a resource or a climate regulator or a climate or a scientific curiosity, but as something that is, in the deepest biological sense, available to us, family. Let the darkness soften around you now. Let the weight of the journey we have taken together tonight settle gently, like marine snow, settling on a cold, dark floor, beam to the underside of the Arctic ice, where algae cling to frozen ceilings and shadow-fixing bacteria make food from gas and darkness. Post Bonston, you have descended through the Atlantic water layer, that ghost river of warmth moving north through the cold, reshaping everything it touches. You have drifted in the ancient bottom water with the Greenland shark 500 years old, moving through cold that has not changed in centuries. Quad Sud. You have stood at the Polaris hydrothermal vents, roaring with hydrogen and methane at the top of the world, and at the Freya methane mounds where gas cathedrals rise from the seafloor 3,000 metres into the dark, have sat with the Asgard, Archaea in the sediment, carrying in their genes the memory of the transition that made you possible, watched the spring bloom explode at the ice edge, visible from space, feeding everything from atmosphere to abyss. You have listened, much as anyone can listen to something that speaks in sound rather than language, to the bowhead whale singing in the dark, Proust. You have been to the beginning of the story of life on Earth. You have walked the oldest library, Host. You have sat with the most patient things that have ever existed, and now, let the darkness hold you. Host, let the cold of the Arctic deep be something that warms rather than chills, because you understand now what it contains. Let the image of the ice from below, that white ceiling over a living world, be the last thing that drifts through your mind before the stillness takes you. The Arctic is not waiting to be discovered. It has always been there, living its vast ancient life, patient beyond our comprehension, full beyond our knowing, connected to us in ways we are only beginning to understand. And right now, in the hours while you drift into the quiet, it continues. The algae photosynthesize on frozen ceilings. The archaea breathe ancient carbon in cold mud. The shark drifts. The whale sings. The marine snow falls through dark water in a constant gentle rain of life from the surface to the floor. Everything is continuing. Everything that has always continued continues still. Let the darkness hold you now. There is nothing left to find tonight. Only stillness. Only the soft cold patience of a world that has been here since before the first human question, and will be here in some form long after the last. Let it carry you. Let it be enough. Let the Arctic deep, with all its ancient astonishing life, be the last thing you are aware of before the night takes you completely. You are not separate from it. You never were. The ice is still there. World beneath it is alive, and so are you.